So the idea that there was some golden age, even a few decades ago when of free speech and where things were normal, I think is a mistaken interpretation.
The political landscape in Canada is an absolute disaster. That's putting it lightly. All you have to do is have a conversation with your neighbors, scroll through a comment section, and you will see just how badly the woke mind virus and these radical virtue signaling ideologies have completely infested our institutions. They have taken over our media, and worse, they even have an impact on our laws. So in today's episode of Over Opinionated, I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down with Eric Kaufmann. He is a Canadian-born man that has been living in the UK, where he is a professor at the University of Buckingham. He is also an author. I know many of you have read his books before, and an expert on political demography and the culture wars. So we are going to be breaking down exactly what's happening in Canada, from the rise of woke ideology and also some hope in political shifts that could bring us back to sanity. Kaufmann has been in the UK for quite some time and is familiar with Mark Carney, the newly selected Prime Minister of Canada, and he does share some of his thoughts about him as well. We cover everything from how did we get here to why is this happening to us, and most importantly, what can we do to fight back? This is definitely a conversation that you want to hear, where I can guarantee you are going to learn an awful lot about the state of Canada right now. A heads up, by the way, this was filmed prior to Mark Carney winning the Liberal leadership race, so just keep that in mind for that portion of the conversation and some of the other things that we discuss. And other than that, enjoy the episode, like, share, comment your thoughts down below, and give me a follow on other social media platforms as well. I'm Jasmine Lane, and this is Over Opinionated. The amount of people who, when the Canadian flag was being burned, outside of a library or museum, I can't recall exactly what it was, in British Columbia, nobody said a word about it. In fact, I'd be willing to wager that a lot of people were probably in support of it due to this mass indoctrination that has happened. And then you have Trump tariffs being issued, and suddenly those same people now are like, Team Canada, Team Canada. And again, it's seemingly overnight. And I just don't understand, for lack of better words, what is wrong with Canadians, where we are so fickle and so easy to follow whatever the narrative of the day is and don't even question anything at all.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that, there's a whole history of this, which goes back to the progressive, so the liberal left domination of English Canadian culture and identity. That comes from the 60s. When the British Empire declined, there was an identity crisis for the English part of the country, and they latched on to the latest fashions coming up from progressive intellectuals, mainly in the US, to some degree in Europe. Multiculturalism was one of those fashions. Another one was what became political correctness and now has become woke, which is this idea that you have to be super sensitive to minority, race, gender, sexual identity groups. And so that became really the Canadian identity. Was like, well, we're going to be more gung-ho in our celebration of these progressive values than other countries, and that's going to be the new Canadian identity. Now, the progressive ideas had not metastasized to the same point that they had by the time we get into the 2010s. But yeah, we're living through, the dominance of that set of beliefs and the way those shape the national identity. So Canada, in a way, is ground zero for a lot of these ideas coming out of universities, but also a lot of receptivity in other institutions in the country. So a lot of the sort of these progressive ideas from the U.S. I mean, if you look at say, the Black Lives Matter discourse, the settler colonialism discourse, all of that just takes, it's like catnip for Canadian institutions. They're just primed, very fertile soil. So yes, it's happening in other countries, in Scotland and Ireland and England, and it's happening everywhere. But I just think Canada is in some ways at the extreme end of this. There's an argument that, countries that have an identity crisis, Ireland lost its Catholic Gaelic kind of identity to some degree as it modernized. And there's a place that also has seen real overreach on woke ideology. Scotland is another area where, again, they're trying to say, we're different from the English, we're more virtuous. That made them susceptible, I think, to jumping on, the trans bandwagon. So we're going to be more progressive on gender affirmation, whatever it happens to be. So I think an important part of the story with Canada is its definition as the left-wing America makes it open to these new fads, and they're always trying to outdo the U.S. on these fads and make that the center of their identity. So now what that means is, of course, when there's something like this fake mass graves, residential school narrative, they're all in on that because they need it. They want that garment rending kind of storyline.
Well, and now they're trying to make it illegal you're a residential school denier is what they are proposing in law now.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, when there is something like the terror threat, then, national identity is useful now and we're going to reinvent ourselves as patriots. After having, lowered flags at half-mast and denigrated and trashed the country's history and identity for 5 years or however long it was. So now I guess stepping back from it, what we can say is that, and I've always argued that, in fact, there is a woke version of Canadian national identity, which is a version of national identity, which says, well, we are going to be the world's outstanding exemplar of this ideology. We are going to be more woke than other countries, and that gives us pride as Canada. And so that is still a kind of, and I think it's now, if you take something like resisting Trump, that fits into the idea of the left, it's acceptable to wave the flag around that. So it's a kind of left-wing version of national identity, as opposed to the traditional national identity around Confederation and, the settling of Canada. That's now garbage, and we're going to just trash that and change names and knock down statues of fathers of Confederation and so on. So I think that kind of explains the contradiction that the flag can mean different things. So it's now being appropriated in a left-wing way, and whereas in the past what they were trying to do was sort of, in the past what it was the flag represented something that was against the left, then you trash the flag. If it's something that supports the left, then you embrace the flag. So it's very instrumental. That's sort of how I'd explain the contradiction.
And why do you think that change in attitude and mindset was able to happen so quickly? Like I said, like it being here, it quite literally feels like it happened overnight. One day, you had people who were trashing you if you were part of the Freedom Convoy, who were trashing you if you were a conservative, using slurs and insults. And within 24 hours of that announcement from Trump, those same people were suddenly adopting all of the same policies and views of the country that you've always had. How is it that just this complete, I want to describe it as mental anguish of Canadians was able to form so rapidly? Because it doesn't feel in this country, we've always had a level of that. Absolutely, you're correct. But it doesn't feel how it used to. It feels very vitriolic and very radical these days. And I find myself very much questioning, how did all of this happen seemingly overnight?
Well, okay. I mean, the first thing I would say, and I always say, is this is not as new as people think. When I was growing up in Vancouver in the 80s, for example, you could not criticize multiculturalism, you could not criticize immigration, or you would effectively be the equivalent of being canceled. So the idea that there was some golden age, even a few decades ago when of free speech and where things were normal, I think is a mistaken interpretation. There was a Trinidadian Indian descent writer called Neil Basundath who wrote a book in 1994 criticizing multiculturalism. He was of Indian origin. He was raked over the coals and turned into a pariah. I mean, so what I would say is that Canada has had this very intolerant left-wing cultural leftism for some time. Now, it is true that it's gotten more extreme, and all of these things have gotten more extreme because of social media. You can just keep pressing the like button and cancel somebody. And the more wild critical race theory ideas, now they made a bit of an appearance in Bob Rae's NDP government in the early 90s when he tried to get the equivalent of critical race theory in Ontario schools and mandate equal pay for work of equal value by sex. So it's like we did have some precursors, but it wasn't as sustained as it became in the 2010s. So I do want to caution people to imagine that this is brand new. It builds on a foundation that was already there. The highest values in Canada were already centered around multiculturalism and immigration, which was basically around we are more anti-racist than any other country, and therefore we're more virtuous. This is just taking that up a notch. Now, and extending it to sex and transgenderism and other things, but it's the same basic identity totems. It was still, in the 90s, early 90s, when we had political correctness, again, it was around racism, sexism, homophobia. Now we've added transphobia, but the same basic ideas were there. It's just gotten a bit more extreme because of social media and mainstream media. Some of these ideas were more on campus, and they've now flowed off campus more. But I think the problems are deep-seated, and they cannot be this idea that there's this backlash against woke and it's going to disappear. That's wrong. The problem is the highest values of society still revolve around anything that's in the name of anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia. Those are the highest values that Canada is trying to exemplify. As long as that's the case, extremism and fundamentalism on those fronts will continue to be a possibility. So I really want to caution against the idea that this is new. The second thing I'd say is, if you take this switch, the way the flag was used, there was this period where, the woke stuff in the U.S. kind of peaks in 2020, 2021, and you already start to get, editorials in the New York Times, Washington Post saying, forcing people to sign statements approving of diversity, equity, and inclusion before they have access to a job is a bad idea. Or, there is a problem with left-wing illiberalism around free speech, or diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't work. All of that stuff was coming out in major U.S. publications in like 2023, 2022 to 2024. I think now in Canada, of course, they just doubled down on all this stuff and pushed it harder. However, I think there was a certain extent to which there was a perception, okay, this is not as fashionable anymore, and we've got tech leaders backing away, corporate leaders backing away from it. That has some effect, I think, and at least so. If you look at the aggressiveness around the mass graves thing and the flying of the flag, I think some of that it wasn't as extreme. It's still there, of course, in Canada, but you didn't get the sense they were pumping it quite as hard in 2024 as they had in prior years. So you had the beginnings of a slight step back from insanity, still a big problem, but not totally insane. And then you suddenly had this Trump thing. And that of course leads to a sudden adoption of the flag. That's sort of how I would read it.
And what do you think is the motive for elected officials and even the mainstream media to be pushing a lot of that ideology and rhetoric as hard as they are? As you had said, like having to declare your allegiance to certain hiring practices with DEI. Like, I promise you, I'm not a racist, and I'm going to make
right.
sure, like that stuff. It's so silly and to the point where even doing that in and of itself feels kind of racist, but yet there's so much of Canadian culture that's backed on that. And it's something that is driven hard through the media so much these days. And I've always asked myself, what exactly is the motive? Because in my view, at least, none of those things signal a strong leader. Like a lot of it seems like it's a fault more than anything. It signals almost weakness in some capacity, especially in terms of the military and things like that. And so what do you think, if you could hypothesize, what the motive is for those in power who are using that in order to remain in power?
Well, I mean, Okay, what I would say is I think these are the true beliefs of a lot of the activists in the Liberal Party and the NDP and in the sections of the progressive media, so they really believed in this. And so as I get back to this idea that, if you look at the left, it's pivoted away from class, from redistribution and unions as the dominant theme, to identity, from class to identity. That is, we are going to be the anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic political party. That's our identity. So the switch to those identity markers really takes place in a big way in Canada, as it does in other Western countries. So the left now is supported by, university towns, by urban elites. That's sort of who are in touch with these intellectual currents. So intellectual fashion is moving in that direction. And then I think just in the Canadian case, but as perhaps in some of these other countries like Ireland, where there's a weak identity, because in Canada, the old British identity, which was the basis for English Canada's identity for 200 years, collapses. So you have this identity crisis, and that just magnifies their desire just to be defining the country. And, we are going to define ourselves as the kind of what would have been in the past the idea of the eldest daughter of the church. We French are the best Catholic nation, so we exemplify the values of Catholicism. Well, now we exemplify the values of progressivism. So Canada is going to be the most progressive country, and that's its identity. And so that leaves you open to any fad, including very destructive ones. But what I would say is it's building on the earlier multiculturalism, pro-immigration, political correctness culture, which dominated Canadian elite institutions. And by the way, there are examples from the 90s. The UBC political science department was absolutely paralyzed by accusations of racism and sexism. They brought in a high-priced investigator. No individuals could be named, so it was all vague, non-specific garbage. But it just shows that they were so sensitive to any claims made on behalf of race and sex minorities that you could paralyze them easily because the belief structure is already there. And so I think this is the thing to understand, is that you have this set of mores which form the moral universe of all Western societies, but especially in English Canada, let's say. Quebec, if you contrast with Quebec, they have a narrative about the habitants, arriving in the 1600s, building this French society. You don't see the same trashing of the collective memory there that you see in English Canada, where there's a weaker attachment to that memory. Now, you see a few points of resistance, like around Remembrance Day, for example, attempts to inject land acknowledgements and other sort of woke stuff into the Remembrance Day. There you saw a bit of resistance. I will point out that resistance is happening only by 2024, I think, or maybe it was late 23, but yeah, I guess it would have been late in 2024. But already by then, the peak of the woke energy was passing, so maybe people felt emboldened enough that they could push back a little bit. So yeah, this is the problem, and what we need are two things. I mean, one is I think that the shine has come off this ideology to some degree, but I also think that Canada, the English part, needs to renew its connections with a national identity based on who it is, not based on being the most fashionable country progressively in the world.
It's such a bizarre conflict that you have, because it's like your entire life you've been told that everything that you are is evil and awful. You are a colonizer, and your ancestors did this and that. Some of those things aren't even true. There's just all of this rhetoric to make you hate yourself. And then as a result, you face this crisis where now you're very susceptible and weak and trying to virtue signal and feel welcome and accepted. I've had the idea for quite some time that the vast majority of people that fall victim into this ideology, unless you're bred into it kind of through your youth, which obviously in Canadian education systems, that's a big thing. But when there's adults, full grown adults who are, in their 40s or 50s who are falling victim to this, I've kind of always had this view, not to disgrace them at all, but that those are likely people that are facing a lot of insecurities because they don't quite know that they have anything to stand for. And then you're given this thing wrapped up in a bow. And if you come out now at 40 years old that you're non-binary, now nobody can say anything bad to you anymore, or you can destroy them, you know? And so I do find that it's such an interesting place that many people in Canada are, due to a national identity crisis that has been brewing for decades, that now we're in this position where it's like, oh, you're supposed to be Canada now. And it's like, well, what is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole country is being reconfigured by forces which are much broader than Canada. I mean, obviously woke is one element of it. Populism is sort of a counter element. And so this polarization is happening in Canada now. You know, I think it's also worth saying that the culture war is not just the culture war. I always say, like, it has real world consequences. So one of them might be an inability to crack down on crime, because that would be seen as not very nice to criminals, especially if they are disproportionately, let's say, Indigenous or Black or some other group. So that pushes us towards the kind of defund the police model. Mm-hmm. But then you also have an inability to control and deport people who are in the country illegally. That can be another offshoot of having this ideology be dominant and prevent people actually to say what they believe, and preventing policies from emerging. But there are also unintended consequences. So one of which might be this idea of the military. So if you really care, you know, if Trump's saying he's now not going to stand up behind NATO, you know, a lot of Western countries are going to have to make provisions for their own defense. But what do you do when the share of young people who are willing to die for the country, who say they're proud of the country, has collapsed, you know, as it has across many Western countries, because they've been fed this propaganda in school? Now you won't be able to raise a military, and you won't be able to get support for national conscription. You won't be able to actually have a foreign policy. So all of these things people don't think about when they are just gutting the national identity and the tradition of the country. And now all of a sudden they might, oh yeah, we need a military. We aren't getting enough people joining up. What are we going to do? Maybe we, you know, pushing DEI in your military and attacking the country's history in schools, maybe not such a fantastic idea. And so that, yeah, some of those real world consequences of the cultural revolution of woke are making themselves felt. And I think, now, it is inducing a bit of a rethink, but more so in the U.S. I mean, what I see in Canada and Europe is still the progressives are completely in control of the institutions. They are just hanging on. What they're hoping to do is use hate speech and misinformation laws to shut out, competing accounts, clamp down on free speech. And I just don't think that's going to work in the long term. So there is a real crisis. The other thing I should say is that these beliefs we've been talking about, and I'll boil down for your listeners, you know, woke in a one-word sentence. Woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities. That's what woke is. Out of which arises the view that you should have equal outcomes, let's say by race and sex, whether that be if the U.S. is 13% Black, Harvard must be 13% Black. Mm-hmm. If it's 50% female, then the professoriate must be. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. The quota affirmative action idea is one outcome of this, and that's of course a violation of equal treatment, non-discrimination, and merit. And then that's the equality and diversity. Then you have inclusion, which is really about we have to be ultra sensitive to the feelings of anyone. Even the most sensitive person of one of these groups, and so we have to clamp down on your free speech, and we have to not pursue the truth. If the truth is that there are no bodies buried in a Kamloops cemetery, but no, you can't research that, you can't say that. So we're now in this position where this is damaging the truth-based order. It's damaging free speech. It's also damaging attachment to the country. What's interesting too in Canada, though, I find, is that the younger generation in Canada is really quite split. You know, they've had a very heavy indoctrination in the schools, but there's actually a higher share of conservative young people in Canada than, let's say, in Britain, where the young people are almost entirely on the left. Something interesting is happening, and it's in Europe is kind of in between. It looks a bit more like Canada, a lot of conservative young people. as well as a lot of very woke young people. And so I just think what gives me perhaps some hope in Canada is there is an appetite for change amongst a significant chunk of the younger population.
Mhm. It's actually interesting you say that. One of the notes that I had here was there was a recent poll that came out today that the poll sample size was quite low. I think it was about anywhere between, it was like 890 for one of the polls, 1,000 people for the other. But the way that it had described our politics right now was that the vast majority of people who are 16 until 55 were actually very much conservative leaning. It was that older generation, the boomers, as some like to call them, that were the liberal supporters in the country. And I've actually heard a lot of argument to that of people who suggest, well, those people are old enough that they've lived through multiple forms of government, and that's why it's liberal. And I'm, okay, I can see that if you're a loyalist due to that reason. But also the Liberal Party in Canada and in much of the world has dramatically shifted. It is not liberal anymore. It is so far left that the Conservative Party of Canada is actually quite liberal by all definitions. So just an interesting thing. Why do you think that is? Like, what do you think the rise of conservatism amongst younger people is related to?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, younger people are often a canary in the coal mine. They're going to respond. If you've had a government for 9, 10 years of one stripe, they're going to be more likely to react against it. So part of it is this just thermostatic opposition to the incumbent. But I also think there are deeper changes afoot. We know that younger people are less trusting of institutions. They're less likely to tune into CBC and CTV or read the Globe and Mail or these establishment papers, which have a very progressive line. And so I think a lot of it is that. I think for the older generation, the Liberal Party has historically been the natural party of government in Canada. They were seen as, the standard bearers for this Canada from sea to sea national identity that could counteract Quebec separatism. So people of my generation were formed in a time when there were a number of quite credible secessionist votes, in 1980 and in the 90s. So the Liberals were seen as the party of unification. So I think that is partly explains that nostalgia for the Liberals among some older voters. Now, of course, they have moved very much to the left. And so that's probably turned off some of these voters, but I think they still have those residual attachments. I think the younger people don't have those attachments, and so they don't have any of that baggage that binds them to, when they see the Liberal Party emblem, they don't feel anything. And I think so they're easier it's easier for them to switch parties. And I think that's, that helps to explain it. By the way, on the left, you also see younger people, they're more likely to go to the NDP, for example, than the Liberals, particularly young women. But again, that's something we see in all countries. Like, younger people are also, if they're going to be conservatives, like in Europe, they're much more likely to vote populist right than for mainstream Christian Democrats or other conservatives. So there's a degree to which young people are always going to go to the flanks in the newer parties more. Going
back to motive there, when you talk about misinformation and censorship, I know Germany is just wild what is happening there. The UK is quite... it leaves me speechless at times, the things that I read and see. And Canada is certainly adopting that as well. We've had a number of bills brought into Parliament already. C11, C18, C63 has been squashed, thankfully, due to Parliament being prorogued. But there's been a lot of things to hinder free speech. And free speech is something that is not protected in Canada in any way, shape, or form. And it just makes me wonder, and I can't help but, I guess, feel slightly conspiratorial about it, because to me, I'm like, well, what is it that's so bad about a varying opinion? Could that be control? Is it power? Is it total domination? Is it isolation? Like a lot of these bills as well, we saw with Meta, and for a period of time, Google was potentially there until they signed over $100 million deal, I think it was, with the federal government. But Meta News has been blocked in Canada. And so the result of this censorship and some of this ideology it's always put to you in a really great, compassionate way. But then when you actually dig into it, the reality is that, now a lot of Canadians do have their access to media limited as a result. And so what could the possible motive there be? Is there I can't help but think that there's nothing positive of a motive when you're doing things and that's the repercussions and you're not going back on them.
Yeah, so I really think it's a simple. I mean, I tend not to think that the motive is power based or interest based. I think it is more about, this is our ideology. We believe that hurt feelings amongst historically marginalized groups, that's a more, not hurting their feelings or offending them, what's called emotional trauma or endangering their emotional safety. This is the therapeutic language. So what they would say is, well, that's more important than your free speech. And so whenever there's a clash, even if they subjectively, even if they're misinterpreting your signals, if you mispronounce their last name or whatever it is, even if they misinterpret that as some kind of a slight, because they're a member of one of these totemic groups that has a lot of victim points, their word goes over yours. And so essentially they want to clamp down on speech that might offend. So all that's telling us is that emotional harm protection for these totemic minority groups is a higher principle than free speech or the pursuit of truth in their value system. Now, given that it's a higher principle, they'll do everything they can to shut down any speech which might, they think, offend the most sensitive member of these groups. And by the way, that's even if the majority of that group actually would be in favor of free speech. It's not about, all it takes is a few loud activists. So the idea there is, okay, we can do a Twitter mobbing, we can use normative sanctions, we can try and make a person a pariah at work, but what can we do if we've got our hands on the tools of state? Well, we can clamp down on people's speech through misinformation laws, through online safety bills, through hate speech laws, through human rights commissions, dragging them through, for months, and at the cost of tens of thousands of dollars. We can shut them up that way. So all they're doing is using whatever tools they have at their disposal to enforce and get their ideological way. I mean, I think that's really what this is about. So I don't think it's the case that, they're doing it to assert authority. Now, of course, you will find power-hungry people everywhere, and there undoubtedly are going to be those who go on a power trip, hauling people in front of kangaroo courts. But I just think it's much more to do with them simply using whatever tools are at their disposal to enforce and make their ideology win in the public sphere.
I wish I had your brain.
All right.
I might have far less negative thoughts before bed when I'm trying to mull all this stuff over. So you said something at the beginning of this. This is where I'm drastically changing course here because it made me think of it. So you said you've been in the UK for about 25 years?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're super familiar, but I have to ask, Mark Carney, are you familiar with that whole topic and what's going on in Canada right now?
Yes, I am. And because he was chairman, he was led the Bank of England for a number of years here. He's clearly a member of the Liberal Party. He's kind of, taken over from a very deeply unpopular Trudeau. He's been blessed with good timing because of what's happened with Trump. And I actually, I'm pretty critical of Trump's actions, I think, which I think are damaging the cause, if you like, of fighting back against this ideology in other countries.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so I think, I don't, Carney himself is no great political talent. He's benefiting from the rally around the flag effect. Mm-hmm. The same sort of thing happened during COVID. When COVID hit, all the popularity of all national politicians around the world went up because suddenly there was this threat. People are drawn to band together, and the beneficiary is the figurehead, who is the figurehead of nationhood. So that's really what we are living through right now. And unfortunately, as long as Trump is making threats about the 51st state and threats about tariffs, unfortunately, that's probably just going to help boost the fortunes of whoever happens to be the leader. of the Liberals.
I'm curious with any information that you have or are willing to share, in Canadian media, which, as we know, is very largely funded by the federal government. Take that as you will, but does it play an effect in the things that they report? It appears to be so, but who knows? But they've had this spin on Mark Carney as how he saved Canada during the potential recession that we avoided in 2008, and that he saved the UK as well when he was the governor of the Bank of England there, and that he is just this loved and respected man. But then I do research outside of what the news is telling me, and I see quite the opposite. And I'm curious for you. I understand he was there quite some time ago, but what is your opinion on him, his policies? He's been very big into the radical green agenda at the cost and expense of anybody who gets in the way or can't afford it. Your general thoughts there of how that narrative is being portrayed versus perhaps what the reality is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the perception, first of all, the governor of a central bank is quite a technocratic position. You're just trying to set, interest rates, and it's not an exact science. You're largely at the mercy of global forces. It's not clear to me there's any, and there's a whole committee that makes these decisions. So I think this idea that he's had some big effect. I mean, the UK economy is no great shakes. Is it due to him? I probably not. Probably global, many deeper forces. What I would say, though, is, of course, he became identified with the Remain side in the Brexit referendum and was quite critical of the Brexit side, which meant he was then going to be, he was then a political figure. He'd put his cards on the table, and it might have been better as an official to try and remain out of that fight, right? So I think he was just seen as somebody who was in the Remain camp, and he's obviously got ties to global financial institutions, which is whatever. But I just think, to my mind, a lot of the big questions that have led to trouble for Trudeau. Yes, there are the economy is in trouble, but the economy is one of those ones where you don't have a lot of room to maneuver. I mean, if you've got problems with Medicare, let's say you need money for Medicare, but you also need to keep taxes low to get business growth. There's not a lot of. I just think this is somewhat of a managerial issue, whereas I think the cultural stuff is much clearer in terms of positioning parties as being distinctive. And when we haven't heard that much from Carney, although I'm assuming he holds the same cultural beliefs as Trudeau.
Only far more radical, it appears.
Has never indicated to the contrary. But these cultural issues are the ones that are really restructuring electorates and realigning elections in the West. It's around these questions like immigration, culture war, that people are deciding which party to support. Now, of course, there are going to be some voters who are just looking at the price of gas and unemployment and whatever. At different times and places, certain parties may be seen as more competent than others. But I think at the core, the question really is, where does one's values lie? I think in the case of Carney, he was identified as a progressive on these cultural values, and so.
He has a book actually titled Values. So
yeah, so we'll see. I mean, I think, however, it doesn't matter who's really running the show as much as I suppose he doesn't seem to speak very well, so he's not going to be very forceful or charismatic. But the issue is much more that if Trump continues to threaten Canada, that is going to redound to the benefit of whoever's in power in Canada. So. Mm-hmm. A lot will depend, I think, in the Canadian case, on what happens south of the border.
Do you think, we have an election coming and there's so many people here that they just say, please get rid of the Liberals. Our economy is garbage. Our universities are trash. Our military has gone to the garbage too. Everything's in the garbage right now. And people have been saying that, we need a conservative government to fix all of these things. And I'm with you as well. And, economy, policy, things like that. those can be changed by anybody whenever they feel to do so, right? But the biggest issue that we have is the divisiveness within our own communities. That could it have been, intentionally designed? It's likely, who knows? But nonetheless, it exists. It's very present. This radical difference in ideologies between people, and I'm curious to your thoughts as to whether or not a new government that perhaps, let's say the conservatives get in and they don't have some of the same woke ideology and all of those, the spending towards things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Do you think that that would actually have a positive shift culturally for the country compared to having another 4 years of a liberal government?
Well, I mean, I guess there's a number of questions. I mean, I think the first one is, to what extent does public opinion, so I've done a survey with the Macdonald Laurier Institute, the Canadian public's about 2-1 against the woke position on a whole series of questions, whether that be, is Canada a racist country? By 70-30, Canadians say no. Should John A. Macdonald statues be removed? But 2-1 against that, even though almost all, basically they are all removed. On the trans issue, for example, males in women's sports, women's prisons, very strongly against. The question now then becomes, well, what's Poilievre going to be willing to do? Now, I have to say, we don't know. I mean, in terms of what he said, I think the record is not encouraging in the sense that he's come quite late to these issues, and only after there's overwhelming, often even mainstream support. So the same on immigration, he didn't say anything, and it's only when the Globe and Mail and everybody was saying something that he felt he could say something, and that's not a good sign. Now, other people say, well, he was so far ahead, he didn't want to rock the boat. I get that, and that maybe once he gets in, he's going to do something, and I guess that's really what none of us know. I've heard opinions on both sides that quietly he does hold the right views and will implement, but others say, well, he's going to be scared to implement. I mean, part of the problem is that people who want to, be invited to the right Ottawa dinner parties or not be attacked in the media as a transphobe, they're going to want to take the easy path and not face the stairs. So it is good. Now, on the other hand, Poilievre has been, in terms of Canadian conservative leaders, the most willing to take on the media and to be disliked. And so that's a good sign. I think it shows he's willing to take a certain amount of flack for his beliefs. And so I guess the question is whether that will be enough. I mean, we've seen clearly there are plenty of conservative governments like the Ontario one, which is actually very much aligned to the cultural left. And so to my mind, there's no real difference between a Doug Ford and an NDP when it comes to these issues. So I think the key is going to be whether Poilievre actually does listen to his grassroots and does make these, because the point with these cultural issues is they're easy vote winners. It's an open goal. It's 2-1. All you have to do, if Poilievre said, well, we're not going to have men in women's prisons or women's sports, those would be easy winners. But the question is whether he's willing to take the flack, even though those issues are overwhelmingly supported, right? But the elite culture, the elite political culture is hostile. And so you're going to have to break those barriers and taboos in order to make the institutions look like the country. Now, the other thing I'd say, though, so this is about just getting the views of the public reflected inside institutions like the civil service and perhaps the universities. But the question of the culture, that's a longer-term shift. What happens in terms of changing the institutions probably won't have much effect. Now, schools are different. If you can get at schools which are doing indoctrination, then that can change the culture longer term. So that should be a priority, but that's more of a provincial matter. Now, university funding is in many cases controlled federally. So there, I think Poilievre could take a big stand by saying you're not allowed to advertise positions where no white males need apply, that kind of thing. And that sort of abuse is going on all over the place in Canadian academia. But the culture change, that's really a long-term battle of ideas. It's people like you, it's the online world, it's that slow act of persuasion that hopefully we can get to a position. I've been encouraged, some of the elite mainstream media have dialed it back a little bit from the height of defund the police and Black Lives Matter, and there's been a little bit of a move away from that. Can that continue to the point where maybe one day we'll get a sensible elite? I mean, that's a hope. We're a long way away from that, but that's a potential hope.
People who have messaged me and said things to the effect of, thank you for being my voice. I wish that I could share these thoughts. I think so similarly to you, but I can't. I'm going to lose my job, or my wife will leave me. There's been so many things, and I understand all of that. Of course, those are inner conflicts I had to deal with myself prior to pursuing this endeavor. But what words of wisdom, perhaps, or advice, I'm asking you to be a little bit of a therapist here, would you give to people who are feeling really trapped and silenced almost, and they're afraid to just do what they know to be true in the face of potential cancellation, potential job loss, all those things that leave you not living how you feel as though you should be because you're too afraid of what you could lose?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And having faced this myself, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one, if you're at a workplace, if there is an opportunity to somehow find like-minded people, to try and forge those networks. Now, for example, in a university, if you find other academics who are opposed to mandatory DEI loyalty oaths, or the pushing of decolonizing your reading list or something, if you find others, then you can form a committee, and then you can go see the president of the university, and you can maybe get them to. Though there have been some successes in moderating the worst of this. So one option is try and find like-minded others at work. Sometimes it's the case, okay, you found some like-minded others, you're still vilified. Like I think of the gender-critical feminists in universities. Well, what they do is they show up as little as possible to the university. They only go to teach their classes. They have a totally separate world. So cultivating some kind of a separate world that will keep you sane. People who share your outlook, who will speak against the craziness in the system. I think that can help with your sanity as well. Obviously, the little things, to the extent you cannot put your pronouns in, or not wear the rainbow lanyard, whatever it is, something that will, as long as, obviously you have to pick your battles and how obvious. But if you just don't adopt it, you don't sign up for DEI training until you're absolutely forced to. Mm-hmm. These are all different things that you can do to passively this passive resistance as much as possible, or try and ask questions to the point, up until the point you feel comfortable. So all of these are things that I guess the average person can do, as well as trying to support, people like you and those who are trying to fight back. There's now something called the Free Speech Union in Canada, which started in Britain. That's an organization that has been extremely effective in Britain in defending people who've been canceled. So I would say join the Free Speech Union. That's another thing you can do. And don't give up hope.
I like that. It's almost similar how the woke mind virus, we'll just call it that. It's been happening for so many decades, but it happened so slowly and with these little attempts over so many years that you didn't even really notice it until you get to a point where it's like, oh my gosh, what has happened here? And so in rejecting that ideology, it's almost as though a similar process would be the case to be most effective in some regard, at least, unless you're Donald Trump and you're suddenly laying down all these executive orders. But for the average person, those little things do certainly make a very big difference in the long term.
Yeah. And I think also in voting, even if, parties that are slightly better on these issues, clearly you want to be sending that message. If you can get involved in local level school board politics or local government or municipal, any forum where you could maybe make a difference, that's another route. Because one problem is that the woke punch so far above their weight in any kind of local political organization, any councils and bodies and all of these areas that actually exercise a lot of power in life are dominated by progressive activists. And so, but it's not because they're a large share of the population, they're just super political, and it matters for them, matters greatly to them, and it matters less to everyone else. So partly it's about redressing that balance civically, and hopefully, I do think there are hopeful signs. Like, I do think this is now seen as an ideology that went too far, even by kind of left of center, particularly older left of center liberals. They will acknowledge that there are problems. And so I think what I would say is I think that this ideology has lost confidence. And we can't forget that left liberalism, not Marxism, but left liberalism, this cultural left liberalism, has 120 years behind it. It's come through the two world wars and the fall of the Berlin Wall as the dominant ideology. For 60 years, all the attitudes, whether that be sex before marriage or homosexuality, many things which I think I agree with. But on the other hand, they have had victory after victory, no losses for 60 years. Mm-hmm. It now appears that, at least on cancel culture and on the trans issue, they've had a setback. I can't think of any other attitudes that have shifted against them in 60 years. So what I would say is we could be at an inflection point where this juggernaut is losing confidence, and now is the time things begin to turn around. That's my hope. I don't know if that's going to happen.